Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pandemic Science and Society. We are now in the final countdown of our class, only 2 days left, and we have a great session planned for today. Our first speaker is Dr. Robin Nelson from Santa Clara University. She's a professor of anthropology. She will be talking to us about child development and working families during COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Nelson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to try to do this share screen and not mess this up. So give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Remind me how? Oh, start share. Is that how it goes? Yes, here we are. Okay, so can you all see that? All right, excellent. So I'm just gonna, I don't know why I'm acting like the Luddite who doesn't know how to do a PowerPoint presentation, but here we are. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about parental investment in a pandemic. And one of the interesting things about this work for me is that I'm a parent, I study parental investment. I usually do this in other places around the world. And all of a sudden, all of this information I had gathered for my own research came home in the middle of this COVID situation. So the way that I have this set up today is that I'm going to talk to you about child development first. And then at the end, we'll talk about COVID. And so I would love to hear your questions. We can build on the COVID part a little bit later. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is kind of, from an evolutionary anthropological perspective, what is parental investment? What am I talking about when I use this term? How has this human behavior been studied and what do we know now? How has the pandemic impacted parental investment practices? And how is risk and strain distributed across the population, specifically in the United States? Because as you all probably have kind of perceived over the past 4 or 5 months, it's not experienced, the pandemic is not experienced the same way for everyone. So defining parenting, the working definition of parenting is the act of investing in a child during critical years of growth and development and or periods of socio-emotional or psychological need. So we tend to think about this as happening very early in life. And as evolutionary anthropologists, we spend a lot of time thinking about gestation or pregnancy and lactation and breastfeeding, as you can see here by these graphics. But we're also thinking about adolescence, right? We're also thinking about the college years. We are thinking about adult children as well, even when they are going through crisis and family steps in to support them. So parental investment from an evolutionary perspective, this term parental investment that I'm using, it really just means investment or giving of oneself in a way that increases the parent's inclusive fitness or kind of their contribution to the gene pool at a cost to other or future reproductive investment. And what that means is that you are investing in your offspring and you are doing that at a cost, right? You don't have the same energy for child 15 that you had for child 1, right? And your body doesn't have the same resources to give. So you're doing this investment at a cost. And so from an evolutionary perspective, that's how we think about parental investment. So when we think about parenting and we think about direct investment, we might think about things like material resources or psychosocial support, time, and of course, as I just mentioned, physical effort or gestation or lactation. But then from an evolutionary perspective, we also think about indirect investment, which is genetic inheritance. And we're not going to get into that part of it today, but just so you understand the kind of broad strokes of this definition. And so when we picture parental investment, one thing that we can kind of keep in mind is that we have this caretaker child unit. And I want to make sure that we include, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, that we include as many different kinds of caretakers as we can, right? Because when we think about genetic inheritance, we are often thinking about a paternal contributor or a maternal contributor. But when we are talking about the practical, everyday responsibility of raising kids, that can be done and is done by lots of different kinds of people. And so some of the things that we think about are feeding, right? Basics, attachment. Attachment's really important. You might have heard of the Harlow monkey experiments that happened years ago, where they had this little monkey and they gave it a kind of terry cloth fake mother, or a mother that was made out of wire. These were real experiments that were done. This is before Aya Cook and IRB and all the things that don't allow us to do unethical research now. But they gave her this wire monkey that had milk. And the monkey, the baby monkeys, would kind of starve themselves to be held, right? And so we know that, or to be near something soft, really. So we know that attachment, and like psychosocial attachment and physical attachment to adults, is important, and to other people is important. Companionship is important. Physical care, so, changing diapers, making sure children are looked after. And then, of course, real technical instruction. What are you doing? How are you doing it? Or even a child watching you and you're kind of going about your business, but that's also instruction, right? And so some of the factors that influence this the facilitation of these different things, feeding, attachment, companionship, yada, yada, are things like educational resources. What do they look like in the community? What are the socialization opportunities for a child? What are the wage earning responsibilities of the caretakers, right? So how do they work and when do they work? What are the caretaking responsibilities for the caretakers? Meaning, right here, we're thinking about caretaker child unit, but that caretaker may also be caring for other children, maybe thinking about special needs children who have extra needs, elder care, anything like that, right? What are the local policies that support parents or don't support parents and caretakers? What are the parenting choices and ideologies? So what do parents believe make for a good parenting child relationship? And then what are the social and government resources that are available if you need help? And so we can think about things like food banks. We can think about WIC, which is a resource that women who are low income can use to feed their children. We can think about mutual aid, which is becoming more and more prevalent during this coronavirus, which is just, organizations coming together to provide resources for the community. And so from an anthropological perspective, there's a wide range of variation when we think about parenting. One thing that we tend to think of as universal, quote unquote, is a maternal-child dyad. One of the reasons why we tend to think about that as universal has to do with gestation and lactation and those very practical demands of maternity very early on. There's been a lot of anthropological work on foraging populations. You might have read this in anywhere, maybe not, but you might read it in college, you might read it coming up in classes, but there's a lot of data collected on what we used to call kind of hunter-gatherer populations or foraging populations. And so you see all these papers written on attachment and communal care. So communal care is when you have lots of adults taking care of the kids, and breastfeeding practices. And then there are quote unquote Western populations, and we can problematize that term as we should, but we think about things like varied attachment. So what are the different ideologies about how much attention, love, affection, yada, yada, you should give your kids? Paid communal care. So some people say, well, I don't have any support system. I don't have, communal care system. If your child goes to daycare, you have a communal care system, right? That is just paid communal care. We also have multi-generational dwellings, right? And so the way that these things show up, these care systems, vary quite a bit. And so I have a picture here of Aka men, because they are known to carry the kids quite a bit. And that's not seen everywhere around the world where men are doing a ton of carrying. And so when we account for this variation, so why do we see these differences around the world, right? And so what we see is some engagement in regional and international labor markets that might pull people away from their families. People are migrating away. You have political histories and local policies. So are there political histories that have influenced parenting practices? We can talk about the influence of formula companies in certain parts of the world in South America impacting breastfeeding rates, things like that. Also parental leave. Does your country have paid parental leave? That impacts, the ability of people to invest in their kids. And then we can think about situations that are traumatic to say the least, but resettlement or forced migration might really influence your parenting practices and what the children receive, because the parents are in the middle of a trauma crisis situation. And in the cases we see in US politics recently, there has been family separation, right? So there might even be separation from parents. And so from a sociological perspective, we tend to think about these groupings of families, nuclear families and extended families and lone parent families, reconstituted or step families, and same-sex families as well. And so I don't have to go into all of these in depth, you know what they are, but just so you understand that these things have been really defined. And part of this project from a theoretical standpoint has been to kind of understand what people may be experiencing, and if people are experiencing different things, if they are in a nuclear family or a small unit with a man and a woman who are legally bound, or an extended family, which is, you know, close relatives beyond the couple and their children all living within the same household, a lone parent or a single parent. We tend to think about single parents, households in the US is how we talk about it. Frequently the mother, and so statistically, lone parent families are typically female-headed families. And there's a relationship actually between female-headed households and poverty, and that has a lot to do with wage opportunities for women, availability of childcare for women, the gender gap with pay, all of those things show up. And then reconstituted families where parents are coming together and reconfiguring their family. And then of course, same-sex families as well. And so when this is broken down by race, also problematic, but this is how the data are collected. So, you know, I'm going to present it how they're collected. When we start looking at, you know, who is living in two married parents or the mother only, this is, you know, it varies based on racial background, cultural background, but that doesn't necessarily speak to the health of that family setting. And so I want to kind of, for the purposes of this conversation, let's be very mindful to deconstruct a kind of hierarchy of family settings where we are putting a kind of nuclear family at the top, where that's the best for families and for kids, and everything else beneath it, because that's not necessarily true. And it has a lot to do with the support that the parents and the kids are receiving. Okay, so let's go back to this for 1 second. Okay, let's go back to this for 1 second. So we've talked a little bit about different families, and now we're going to talk about resources and child development. So that's actually a picture of my own kid. I try to use my own kids when I can so that I don't get in trouble for using other people's kids. But so when we think about child development specifically and what's happening in these homes, what we know is that kids are experiencing changes in physical, social, emotional, and intellectual functioning over time from conception through adolescence. So that's what we're kind of studying, right? So we're looking at the physical development, we're thinking about the cognitive development, but we're also thinking about the social and emotional development. And those things are not necessarily happening in lockstep, right? And so kids are getting kind of bigger, but they may not be socially and emotionally mature yet, right? So we need to be paying attention to how this is happening. And so some of the influences on child development are kind of the rate of maturation of the kid, the environmental factors, what is the setting the child is living in, what resources do they have available to them, what access to resources do they have with regards to learning and socialization. And that's me. So when we think about childhood, we tend to think about kids from ages 3 to 7. And this is from a bioanthro perspective, really. When we think about psychology or sociology, these definitions don't necessarily hold. So these, you know, from an anthropological perspective, we tend to think of childhood as a socially and culturally constructed period of time, because childhood is not experienced the same way across cultures. Right? Kids are not all protected, a protected class. Kids don't have the same learning opportunities. They're not taught the same way, right? So it's socially and culturally constructed. From a bio perspective, we tend to think about this little, you know, 3 years old to 7 years old as a biologically distinct period of time from the juvenile state. There's a very slow rate of growth. So maybe some of you lived in a home where your parents or caretaker or big brother or whatever was marking off on the wall as you were growing every single year, right? That's that slow rate of growth we see in childhood. So if kids get the right nutrition at the right times, we tend to see this kind of tick-tock of growth. We see a post-weaning, so after breastfeeding or after formula feeding, dependency on preparation of solid food. So you need someone to help you when you're young to get your food together. Immature dentition and immature digestive organs. With regards to brain growth, we tend to see rapid brain growth before and after birth. So, you know, babies have these huge heads, right, that are just kind of wobbling on their little bodies, right? So they have a lot of brain growth going on really early. And the brain to body size ratio of humans is really, really high as compared to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. And so we have really high encephalization. So baby brains are really big, and then we have a lot of brain growth right after birth, and that's different from other mammals. So that's my daughter. You can see the eruption of her first deciduous tooth there, right? So deciduous tooth are your milk teeth or your baby teeth, right? And so from a child development perspective, one of the things that new parents are looking for and thinking about, we're like, when are the teeth going to pop out? When are they going to say their first word, right? And from an evolutionary perspective, we like to compare these things like the first eruption of the tooth to other species, because what it tells us is that human childhood is this really long, drawn out period of time where we do a lot of physical growth and a lot of social and emotional growth. So in addition to these kids, I also just got a puppy. Don't ask, it's COVID, right? And one of the things that's so fascinating to me as an evolutionary anthropologist is that the puppy is growing rapidly, right? We got the puppy in June at 8 weeks. It was teeny, it was adorable. That puppy is like a big kid now in our house, whereas my human babies are growing very, very slowly, and they're taking a very long time to learn the rules, right? And so that's what makes human childhood very unique. We see the same thing with kind of the eruption of the first permanent tooth and brain weight. And you see that humans up here in the right-hand corner are completely off the chart, right? Meaning that we are growing, our brains are big, but our teeth are growing we're kind of developing slowly as compared to other species. So the juvenile stage is the stage after childhood, before puberty. Social animals, say like a chimpanzee, they can typically survive the death of a parent at this time. However, at this moment, and this holds for humans too, we have a really slow growth rate, right? So we're just this tick-tock growth. It's predictable and it's stable if your resources are predictable and stable. And what we see during this juvenile period is that if kids experience some kind of stressor, they can also experience catch-up growth. So in the worst case scenario, which unfortunately is what I study to some extent, I study some kids who have been experienced abuse and neglect. They might have experienced nutritional deprivation for 6 months before they got out of that house and into a different space where they then got enough food. And you can see some catch-up growth where their body is able to kind of catch back up. However, if that deprivation continues over a long period of time, they can't and they won't experience catch-up growth. And so when we think about child development, and I think this will come in handy for our conversation about COVID in a couple slides, is that there's this big debate, which I won't go into too much about, but like nurture versus nature, and I'm sure you've heard that before. But the idea, and parents put a lot of pressure on ourselves about this, right? Like, is what I'm doing really important? Is it the environmental factors and experiences? Or is it just who my kid is, right? Is it just kind of who or how they were born, their biology and their genetic factors? There's a lot of discussion in child development about how much nature and nurture kind of contribute to the potential life experiences of a child. And so the way that this has been studied is you got these longitudinal twin studies, lots of them all over the place. lots of journal articles, 8,000 pairs in the one Minnesota twin family study. So psychologists have been working on this for a very long time to figure out how we can understand child development and how we become who we are as we grow up. There have been some limitations though. Folks question when learning really begins, and can we ever identify environments as equal when we look at twins? Equal but just different. And so when we think about child development, there are two kinds of models. There's the continuous model, like development is smooth and gradual, and then you'll see this kind of quantitative change over time. But then there's another model, that's the discontinuity idea, where that is development is abrupt and unstable, and you see these big qualitative changes, and this is implicit in stage theory. So if you've ever thought about or read or seen anything about, this is the toddler stage and then this is the next stage, and we kind of chop up kids' childhoods, it's about a discontinuity model where we think about kids as experiencing these rapid spurts of change. And parents will talk about that, like, my kid just went through a burst of language development, right? And so that fits more with a kind of discontinuity idea of child development. But the thing that we want to think about, and this will make sense when we start thinking about the stress of COVID, is that when you look at, think of any of you who have a family member, a young family member, or a friend who has a child or anything like that, when you don't see them for a long time, they seem completely different the next time you see them. You're like, I saw that baby, it was teeny, I saw them 2 weeks later, and all of a sudden it looked like a toddler. If you view child development from far away, it tends to look very choppy. If you see child development over time every single day, it appears very gradual. So parents sometimes and caretakers don't even realize their kid has gone into this next stage because they're with them every single day. And it might be a grandparent or a teacher or whomever who notices that this kid is in this brand new stage of life and you don't really notice it. So we need to think about development as dynamic and complex, and it's a pattern of gradual and abrupt changes. And so this becomes a little bit important here. I'm going to talk to you briefly about critical periods versus sensitive periods. And so critical periods are a specific period during which an environment has its greatest impact on development. And a sensitive period are times that are optimal, but not necessarily required for the development of certain behaviors. So when we start thinking about COVID and kids not being in school and kids being away from their peers, you might hear a wide range of parental concerns about how that's going to impact the kids. And what's often being perceived is the difference between a critical period, like, is this a period where my kid needs to be in school because they were learning this specific thing, or a sensitive period? We get them back in school, they'll be okay. But this would have been good if they could have been in school right now. And so we have these, we know from child development that there are all of these ages where different kinds of things are happening. And so when we think about kids being outside of their kind of normal social situations, we want to think about how old they are and what they might have been experiencing at this time, whether that can be replicated in the home or not. And so development is influenced in multiple ways by both the individual and the environment. So the kid is bringing something to this space, right? If you have a very shy child, they're not going to be out there running around shaking everybody's hand on the playground, right? They're bringing something to their environment. And then also the environment is giving something to the kids. And so it's a transactional relationship that we need to remember. I think sometimes caretakers, myself included, forget that because we want to just give to our kids. And our kids need to be able to receive that. And it's continuous and dynamic. So no single influence determines the entire outcome of development. So there are, from an anthropological perspective, we tend to think of these universals and the way that they just develop in all kids, things like language, hearing. Some of this is ableist, though, I'll be honest with you, because kids are still often developing cognitive stuff, even if, say, they are unable to speak, right? Like, we don't want to just classify certain things as universals, and then that means that kids that don't experience them are somehow not developing. They are. And so there's this quote that in some respects you are like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person, right? So and that's kind of, I think, embodies anthropology a little bit too, right? It's what we do as a field, is understand that. So I'm going to skip this little bit about brain development. You guys kind of get the point. Things are happening at critical periods. And let's talk about stress, because now we're going to talk about COVID. So stress is good in moderation, right? In moderation, that's kind of key. Positive stress we tend to think of as short increases in heart rate, respiration, and mild and temporary elevation in associated stress hormones. So I try to think of some positive examples in this case. If you like horror films, this is going to be a positive stress experience for you. You go in, you have some jump scares, you know, and then it's over. You walk out, everything kind of relaxes back down, and you're okay. If you like roller coasters, same idea, right? But even something more dramatic and scary, like a car accident, is similar in this way. Say it's a minor car accident without any real injury. You're scared, everything gets tense, you're worried. But then if everything's okay, you calm back down again. That's actually not bad. We need our bodies to kind of learn to respond to stress and fluctuate, our hormones to fluctuate appropriately. So positive stress is not a bad thing. Tolerable stress is temporary but serious, and the incident and impact can be buffered by social relationships. So think about maybe a really bad breakup with someone, right? It's painful, it's physically painful. It is very stressful, but your social relationships can help you move through to kind of survive and move past this experience. But then there's toxic stress. And toxic stress is experiencing strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity. This is really hard on the body. It is very unhealthy. It can impact psychosocial and cognitive development in kids. It can impact heart disease rates, cardiovascular health in adults. Toxic stress is not good. And I'm from New Jersey, so we like to stress all the time. That's our thing. I live in California now, which is weird because everyone should chill out here. I don't understand it. But what I've learned as a biological anthropologist is tolerable stress is okay. Toxic stress is not good. And so we don't want to fetishize being stressed out all the time. It's not good for you. So here we are with COVID. All of a sudden in March, and so I pulled some headlines. So this is San Francisco Chronicle from March 17th, New York Times from March 21st, and the Orlando Sentinel from mid-March. And all of a sudden, the entire country has been made aware of this new virus all at once. None of us are really prepared for this. We're probably more comfortable with flu. We've heard of Ebola, that broke out a few years ago in another country, but most of us were not in the space where that was happening, right? And so now we're trying to figure out what this means and how to navigate this COVID-19 outbreak. So what do we know at this particular moment in March and April? We know it's a new strain of coronavirus. If you're into health and you know, sciencey stuff like me and your professors, we know that coronaviruses are actually really common, but this is a new strain of coronavirus, so that's nervous making. The treatment is unclear. Okay, so the reason why I'm reviewing these things with you is just to kind of highlight for you why this would be stressful, right? The treatment is unclear. It's one thing if we know that there's a new disease, but we all feel like, okay, but I just got to go to my doctor and I got to get a Z-Pack and I got to do this and I'll be okay. We don't know what to do with coronavirus. That uncertainty, I will tell you, primates, humans are primates, we are terrible with uncertainty. We don't deal with it well. It's very stressful to us. So treatment is unclear. Medical supplies are in demand. So where would you go if you got sick? You would go to the hospital. Well, now we have pictures of healthcare workers like this woman here on the right saying that they need PPE. PPE is that, you know, as you know now, that basic mask, you know, proper gown, proper gloving procedure. the nurses, the healthcare workers, the staff who are cleaning the hospitals, they know they don't have enough of this, right? So that's very worrying, because now you got folks thinking, am I sick enough to go to the hospital? Because I don't know that I want to go to the hospital. Transmission is unclear. None of this is great for folks to feel comfortable maintaining any kind of homeostasis with regards to the stress levels. Because we are not sure at this moment whether it's, remember they were telling us hand washing? Remember they were concerned about masks, so they told us not to wear masks, right? That was all very confusing, and it did not help us feel like we could navigate this space very well. Finally, testing materials and protocols around testing were also variable. So people were feeling sick and they didn't know whether they could get tested, and in many places they could not get tested, right? So all of this is kind of, imagine you are an adult taking all of this in, and you have a child of various ages. I mean, if you have an infant or a toddler, you can kind of protect them from this a little bit. If you have an adolescent, you can't, right? They're consuming the news just like you, and there's no way to kind of buffer this for them. So a tolerable stress is getting stretched in this particular moment. What do we know about coronavirus growth rates in this moment? Well, we know that the curve is kind of peaking upwards, which is also quite stressful because it's unclear how to prevent yourself from getting sick at this particular moment. And so if you were in a major city in the country, and then as it kind of spread inward, Chicago, Michigan, other places in the middle of the country, all of a sudden we start seeing that our risk is going up in all of these spaces. And so all of a sudden, what do we get? We have a patchwork response that includes a shelter-in-place designation with social distancing. These are all words that are now incredibly familiar to us, but if you remember back in March and April, we didn't know what any of this was. Shelter-in-place. Shelter-in-place in California means you have a fire or an earthquake or something like that. So shelter-in-place for a virus, and if you're back east, right, it might mean a hurricane. If you're in the Midwest, it might mean a tornado, right? So shelter-in-place for a biological, for a virus is odd. That's not something that we would have known what to do with. Social distancing, all of a sudden we're not allowed to be around our friends. We're not allowed to go to work. What's this 6 feet rule? What is this mask? Are we supposed to be wearing masks or not wearing masks? So by March 25th, we have 35 million kids who are all of a sudden out of school, right? So they're just home. Restaurants, theaters, bars, clubs, recreation areas closed. Now I remember I was teaching at this time and I kept telling my students, you know, guys, I think you need to be prepared for this to disrupt your life. I know that our college is still, you know, we're still in class, but I just don't know. And I was trying to kind of give them a heads up. And I remember we had class Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I came in Monday and I said, guys, I really think that this is gonna shut us down pretty quickly because I think the university is gonna wanna close this down before there's a case. And you know, when I got home that day, we were home. That was it. And so I never saw those students in class again, which was also kind of hard and startling. We also have the emergence, and this will go back to child development in a second, the emergence of a new kind of quote unquote hero, the essential worker, right? And so who's the essential worker in this case? It's people who work in food services. It's people who work in delivery. It's folks, it's of course, law enforcement officers who are still working, EMTs who are still working, doctors, nurses, all of those folks are the essential workers. But we also have a work from home class, right? And so these are people, and when I say class, I mean socioeconomic class. These are people whose jobs were less in danger and they were able to move and work from home, right? And some of that, we're gonna see a link between, or I should say, the kids who had to go home, there was no distinguishing whether your parent was an essential worker who had to go in, someone who lost their job because they worked in entertainment or services in any way, or the work from home class, right? Like kids are in all of these families. And so what's the emerging experience in this particular moment? So this might be generationally off for you guys, but that's Mary Poppins, of course, and that's Mrs. Hannigan from the first Annie, right? Mrs. Hannigan is a terrible caretaker. Mary Poppins is a great caretaker, right? So you see the progression after 5 days. And so what we see for this emerging experience for caretakers in this particular case is the second shift begins to stretch all day. So those of you who may be familiar with any gender studies stuff, the second shift is this idea that women come home and they do a whole second shift of work on top of their outside of the home work. So they come home, they cook, they clean, they're getting the kids ready, all of that. All of that is now happening all day. It's not just happening after your work day. You see these really clear gendered inequalities in parental and caretaking labor because all the folks that were helping us are now no longer around, right? So teachers, daycare workers, aunties, grandparents, any of these people, we're supposed to be sheltering in place, so they're not around anymore to help you with your kids. So we start to see emerging socioeconomic inequities. I mean, they were always there, of course, but we can see them now regarding access to the internet and online learning, because all of a sudden schools are saying, we're going to go online. What does that mean if you don't have reliable internet in your home, if you don't have a tablet or a laptop for your child to use, if you as a work from home person don't actually have the resources you need to work from your own home to continue to earn money for your children? So we talk about this as the digital divide. The other issue with all of this is the uncertainty, okay? So we're back to uncertainty again. Is this gonna be 2 weeks? Do you guys remember this in the very beginning? They told us we were going home for 2 weeks, right? And so I remember delusional, because I am a biological anthropologist and I should know better, that they said 2 weeks and my kids were coming home for 2 weeks and I just said, I can do 2 weeks. I knew it wasn't going to be 2 weeks, but I could not talk to myself about that. So 2 weeks, is it going to be 2 months? Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be 2 years? We talk about a vaccine, but vaccines are very, very hard to make. And so we don't actually know when a vaccine is going to be available or able to be distributed to the entire population in a way that allows us to go back to whatever our post or pre-COVID life was like. So I'm tweeting. And I tweet, and this is in June because we all got sent home in March. And I tweet, at some point we're going to have to actually talk about childcare. Just, folks are still working from home with their kids and it's still impossible. I've never gone viral before for anything. This tweet resonated, who knew, right? And so I get some phone calls from local newspapers and things like that. And this is the moment I was speaking about at the beginning of the lecture where I said that what I know about child development is all of a sudden colliding with my personal life, right? So in this moment, I am talking about my life because my kids are running around me. I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. They're running around me. But I'm also worried and getting increasingly worried about what my children are not experiencing by not being in school, their routines, their other caretakers. And everybody was very stressed about their kids doing online learning. But what became very clear was that as the school year ended, we had no options for our children, no camps, none of these things were available. And so you start really worrying, okay, I'm supposed to still be working and I'm lucky enough to have a job and to be in the work from home class, and I'm still concerned about my kids. So what do we know is missing from kids not being in school? Well, there's no non-kin caretakers helping out anymore. So who's paying close attention to your children? What learning opportunities are we able to provide as compared to what they were able to get in school? Do we feel like we're doing enough? Are they missing any of these critical periods? Or is it just a sensitive period where they're going to be able to catch up, right? Where you see parents getting very concerned about this. What about the peer-to-peer interactions? How okay are your children being completely away from their friends? And if we think about this from your children's perspectives, and I'll talk about it from a mid-childhood perspective. My son is 8. He kind of gets COVID, but he doesn't really get it. And all he knows is he went to school one day and then he never went back again. Right? And so what are they missing from the lack of peer-to-peer interactions? Are they getting enough physical activity? Are you safe enough? Are you in a space that allows you to get physical activity? There are a lot of people in spaces, in homes, where they can't just send their kid outside, particularly in a pandemic. So that's also worrying. What about appropriate dietary supplementation? For many children across the country, school is a source of 1 to 2 primary meals a week, right? A day, all week, right? And so if they're not in school, then there may be real gaps in the food that they have available to them just due to the lack of financial resources. And then finally, in the worst case scenarios, but it's important to bring this up, that lack of extra eyes on your children means that kids who are experiencing abuse and neglect are not getting the help that they need because people in their community can't see what's happening. So there was a big concern about increased rates of intimate partner violence or domestic violence and childhood abuse and neglect during the shelter and the most intense moments of shelter in place because people could not get out of their homes so that other people could see them, help them in any way. And so I'm almost finished here, guys, don't worry. But what we see here is this inequity in everything, and it's starting to really play itself out in pretty intense ways. We see the emergence of learning pods and tutors and folks hiring people to help them take care of their children. So I know families where their kids are doing some work from home schooling, and they've hired full-time nannies to watch the children during the day so that they can work. Whereas we know that there are many, many more essential workers who are actually struggling quite a bit with childcare because they are forced to go into work and there's no one to watch their children right now. So a very stark inequity there. We can return to this idea of the digital divide. This picture went viral, the one on the left, just earlier, about 5 days ago, of 2 girls using the internet outside of a Taco Bell, which had a free internet, because they were trying to do their schoolwork and didn't have internet at home, versus the picture on the right, which is a photo of kids who are grouped together in a kind of learning pod where their parents have the resources for them to have internet at home and can work together, and they are doing a kind of social distancing together to kind of mimic school. The challenge here from both a social science and hard science perspective is that there is no solution in sight. We don't know when this will end in terms of timing. We also, what this has kind of exposed with regards to child development and parental investment are stark divides that people were just always muddling through and doing the very best they could, but now it's in sharp relief because of COVID. And so when we think of child development, parental support, that kind of thing, there are lots of different factors that we can think about. Some we can think of as being, from a biological perspective, relatively easy to think about: exposure to pathogens, physical growth of a child, psychosocial stressor support. But in this moment of COVID, we also want to be thinking about peer-to-peer interactions and the social competence of a child, the familial resources. Does the child have food or housing insecurity? What are the cultures of child rearing and community practices? And are any of these things able to kind of work themselves in and help out in this moment of stress and sustained stress? So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Krista, so much for inviting me.
Of course, thank you for that excellent presentation. The students have a lot of questions, so I want to start with just some clarifying questions. You used a few phrases that the students are hoping you can clarify: multi-generational dwelling and also alloparenting.
Sure. Sorry, guys. I am, like deep in anthro world over here. So I'm like, multi-generational dwelling is literally when you have mom, kids, and maybe a grandparent. You have multiple generations living in one home. And this becomes really important with regards to child development, because it means you have lots of different adults who are able to help out with the kids. And so remember way back in the beginning of the lecture, I said, I don't want us to kind of reify a nuclear family as being always the best setup, because it's not necessarily. There are lots of situations where what we really want for kids is for kids to have a lot of support and a lot of care, and multi-generational dwellings can do that. right? And so dwelling just meaning home. And then alloparental. So allo means other and parent, right? So alloparental means other parent. And so from an anthro perspective and the kind of work I do, we tend to think of an alloparent as a different adult, not one of the, typically not the mother, who is taking care of a child. And because I work in the Caribbean and I work in Canada, I think of alloparents often as sometimes paid caretakers. So like a daycare worker is an alloparent, because you come to pick up your child, that daycare worker is going to tell your kid tell you what they ate, when they use the bathroom, the newest word they have, if they took a step, all of these things, right? So these are people who are helping you take care of your kids who are not the mother, typically. So this comes from primatological literature or primate literature, and so we tend to think of it as extra maternal care. So anybody but the mom.
Perfect, thank you. So students are really concerned about what this means in the long term, and they're asking this question in a lot of different ways. Like, they want to get your opinion on what this might look like for these kids who are going to be growing up, and what that looks like when they're adults. Are they going to be fundamentally different than other people in different age ranges? Is the work from home situation causing accelerated or decelerated child development? And yeah, just generally kind of what are the lasting effects we might see because of this?
So this is my thought on this. So, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the kind of professor answer where I don't really answer you all the way. So bear with me. And I was telling someone I was doing this and they said, oh, the only thing is you don't have a lot of data yet. And I said, I know. We have a lot of data on child development. We don't know what's going to happen with the COVID stuff yet. We just don't know, right? We're only a couple months in. But these are my thoughts. Two things matter quite a bit. How old the child is and the resources the family has. Okay, so we know kids are very sensitive to specific kinds of developmental trajectories when they're really young. So when I showed you that little circular chart and it was like, pick up words and you pick up smell, you can identify colors and smells and all that stuff. That's all happening like preschool age and younger, right? But when kids are, middle childhood through adolescence, the social stuff is really, really important. And so children are going to be impacted differently depending on how old they are. If your parent, now just picture this, you are a parent who has enough money to put together a pod with a caretaker. That kid's probably getting through kind of okay. It's probably not missing too much of the academic stuff they would have picked up in school because they got all these extra resources coming from home. Kids who don't have those resources are going to have to catch up academically. That's going to be hard. I mean, one of the hardest things I think about my work as someone who studies child development is really sitting with the truth of the fact that some kids don't get what they need. And we don't do what we need to do. This is my perspective, right? As a society to take care of those kids. And I hate writing that because it like physically pains me to say, like those kids who are really struggling with internet connection right now, they are not having the same social or academic experience as kids who are in a learning pod. They just aren't. And it is no fault of their own. That being said, all kids are experiencing this right now. And so I tend to think about this as like the scare around the Cold War when my mom's generation was growing up, or the Great Depression, when the Great Depression happened and people's grandparents and great-grandparents were living through the Great Depression. Everybody experienced that. And so if you speak to people of that generation, they also remember that we didn't have this, we didn't have that. It was so scary. It was so long. We were out of a job. So people are experiencing it differently. But the one thing that does actually give me a bit of solace is that there's no kids right now who are not living through COVID. They're all living through COVID. And so they're all having this experience. Now, how detrimental this experience is depends on their resources. Now, decelerated or accelerated child development, again, kind of depends on what you got at home. Were you able, so your kid can't go to daycare. Did you hire a nanny? They're probably fine. They're fine, they're doing great, right? But if you're putting your kid in, I don't want to say in front of the TV because I do it all the time, so no TV shaming here, but it's different than getting one-on-one instruction, right? And so I wouldn't say kids are experiencing decelerated child development. That's not really what's happening, but it's a change. It's a change. And I do think that we can do lots of things to mitigate it, but it's not the same.
Yeah. And that, I think the students would love to hear more about that, what could be done to mitigate it, and if there are any policies in place. I mean, students have been asking about policies related to essential workers, what safety measures are in place for their kids, or also, as you were talking about, the fact that there are disparities. We've heard from a lot of speakers in this course about disparities across the US, and it obviously relates in this situation as well. So are local or state or the federal government putting into place any policies that actually help out the people who can't just go out and get their, a nanny to create a bubble for their neighborhood or whatever?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. Like, what we have right now is a patchwork response. And we, in the United States, we tend to really like this idea that states have the right to decide what they want to do with their resources. I'm kind of like into environmentalism and stuff. And so like being in California, I'm like, that's right. Like we recycle everything. Of all this compost bins out here, like I like that freedom to do that. However, in the moment of a pandemic, what you really get is this very unequal distribution of help for people. So in some places, like there's extensive daycare setups in New York City for essential workers, because remember, New York was hit so hard by the crisis early on. We just heard about a essential worker daycare setup in Rhode Island that had been very successful in making sure that the kids, there were no outbreaks, and they were open for months and months and months. And so folks were looking at that setup, like how can we reopen daycares and schools in a way that maybe we could model what this Rhode Island school did. But what you do need is resources. You need the state, and at the federal level, you need money, because what you're going to need is more teachers, more instructors, so you can keep the classrooms small. You need space. And so what do we know about our educational system thus far? It is not well funded, right? We do not fund public schools very well at all. And so in a lot of spaces, essential workers have had some caregiving networks kind of set up in schools that have opened for their kids, but it's not widespread enough. It's certainly not consistent across states. And I know that like the LA Unified School District just decided it's going completely virtual. LA Unified down in Southern California is home to over 1 million students. Right? No, sorry, 600,000. New York just decided that they're going to wait till September 21st to try to get more resources and testing up and going in their schools so kids can go back to school. New York public school system is the biggest in the country, and they educate over 1 million kids. So what are we seeing here, right? Like these two major cities in the US, very different approaches and resources.
Yeah, for sure. So related to that, are there certain countries or cultures that kind of handle this better, such that, maybe it's more common to have multi-generational dwellings or something, so that there is a better outlet when you have a crisis like this?
Yeah, so this is the kind of, there are a couple places who have handled it much better. Like New Zealand has handled it very, very well. Now, smaller country, of course, but I think that there are a few things that are kind of lacking right now in the United States, and it's unfortunate because they're the exact things we need in a pandemic. So a trust in science and a trust in higher education and researchers has been eroded for years, right? So if you think back, and you might think this is all unrelated, but it's not, but climate denial has kind of edged its way in, because what climate denial did was kind of say, well, these scientists don't know what they're talking about, and we need to do what we need to do. And so now we're in a situation where we need everyone to listen to what the scientists are recommending, and we've already kind of wedged this hole in our society where we don't necessarily trust scientists. So in spaces where science is trusted more, in spaces where there are more kinds of, there is more of a culture of community care, those spaces are doing better. So I'm thinking about Korea, I'm thinking about New Zealand. These are spaces where respect for community is seen as very important. And so if you're sick, you want to take care of yourself. Even mask wearing, I talked about a lot about mask wearing in East Asia and how it was very common in many countries in East Asia before this pandemic. But part of that was about, I think I'm sick, and I don't want to get anyone else sick. It wasn't about, I don't want your germs. It was, this is the polite thing to do. I have germs and I don't want to get anyone else sick, right? So think about how different that is from our cultural practices around mask wearing right now. Though all of these ideas about kind of our own personal rights, individualism versus community care and trust in science, it's a really kind of tough combination at this moment.
That's such an important point, and I think probably not the answer that students were expecting, so I'm happy to hear you talking about that. I will say that this group of students is always asking what they can do to help and how they can make it better. So, I mean, I think you've spoken to some larger societal issues. Do you have advice for them about things that they could do to help specifically with this issue?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, one of the things that we can do, and this is a tougher one, I guess I would say truthfully, but I always say this, and I say this about, Chris, you probably heard me say this about other things, but like, you have to almost be ready to ruin the party. Like the age that you guys are all at, or, you know, I don't want to make assumptions, but like, we're all kind of adults here, young adults here. You might have friends or family members who don't want to take this very seriously. And it may be because they don't feel or perceive that they are at high risk, or they don't feel that anybody in their community is at high risk. We need to be able to somehow bring those folks into the fold. And what we know from science communications is it doesn't really help to beat people over the head with facts, right? So I actually have a sister-in-law who's an anti-vaxxer. It's hard. It's hard as a bioanthro. That's hard. She's also a little bit of a COVID denier. And so when we've been talking, I've been talking about vulnerability and care, right? So that I may not be necessarily worried about me, but I don't want anybody, I have older staff and folks who live and work near me, and I don't want them to get sick. So find that angle for folks in your community who may be less engaged in this, don't want to think about it. I mean, it's scary. There's lots of reasons why people check out of this. It's not just because folks don't trust the science. Sometimes it's just fear, and it's just like, I don't want to think too much about this. So how do we pull folks in and really get them to take it seriously because you care about them and because they care about other people? I think that's a very good angle. And believe it or not, that will go a very long way to slowing down community spread so that kids can get back to school.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. So I want to shift gears just for a second.
Yeah.
Students are really interested from the evolutionary perspective. What are the evolutionary implications of COVID-19 for human populations? Do we know that?
I don't think we know that yet. But remember that human generations are very, very long. We're a long-lived species, right? And so these kinds of things like COVID, like say we get this thing, God willing, under control in the next, few months or so. It probably, I mean, evolutionarily, how do I say this without sounding super depressing? The truth of it is, there are a lot of people of childbearing age who died from COVID. So we do know we've lost some of our population from COVID. That has evolutionary implications, just because those folks may not survive and reproduce. But in terms of like our genetic makeup and are we gonna evolve to be immune to COVID and that kind of thing, that's not the way this works. We are a very long-lived species, and so we are not necessarily seeing in this moment that there's this whole humans who have this particular genetic makeup who are immune to COVID. That's not kind of how this is working. And so the evolutionary implications are that we lose a swath of our population in the same way that we saw with the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic and lots of other very bad viruses that just unfortunately take out certain groups of people, like a big clump of our population.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
the boring evolutionary answer, but
no, but it's true. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really wonderful. We just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask you, are there any last words that you want to leave the students with?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would say, if you have any friends or family who are concerned about their kids, I don't think there's much we can do except just love on those kids, stay kind of connected to them emotionally. I think one thing that we can do as parents, you're asking what we can do in our community, is really check in with kids and their social emotional health right now. I think that we focus so much on education. We want them to do well educationally. I want my kid back in school. I want them back in sports. I want them back doing all these things. How are they feeling? How are they coping? Can we help in that way? You can always help in that way. You can always call a cousin, a friend, whomever, a peer, and just see how they are doing. And then I just would say, care about community. And even if it gets tiring, even if it's annoying, wear your mask, take care of yourselves, and encourage your friends and family to do the same.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. So our next speaker is Harvey Galler, who is a student at Washington University in St. Louis, a prison education program graduate, and currently works with the WashU Prison Education Program. He will be talking to us about COVID-19 and incarceration. Welcome, Harvey.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So can you start just by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background as it relates to the topic of incarceration?
All right. I am formerly incarcerated, and like you said, I'm an alumnus of the PEP program. I earned an AA while I was inside through the PEP in 2019, and I do currently work with PEP as an intern, and I'm in contact with a lot of those individuals that are still incarcerated now. A lot of my friends, I talk to them on a daily basis.
That's great. And so PEP is the Washington University in St. Louis Prison Education Project, just for those of you who aren't familiar. And I was actually hoping that you could tell the students a little about that. We have a lot of incoming students on the call who are just going to be joining us this year, as well as I'm sure other students who aren't familiar with the project. So maybe if you could just talk about it a little bit, kind of the main vision and mission and those sorts of things.
All right, PEP kind of it's an exclusive program, college program in MECC, which is located it's Missouri Eastern Correctional Center, which is located out at Pacific, which is about half an hour outside of west of St. Louis. Anyways, it's exclusive in that there's only maybe 35 students out of 1,000 inmates. So you have to apply to get into it. And it's actually 4 credit college courses taught by instructors and professors from Washington University campus that come out there. And they teach courses from calculus, creative writing, psychology, biology, chemistry, philosophy, economics, anthropology. And also something that's pretty cool about it is they have joint classes where it's a class that's taught on campus alongside a class that's actually taught alongside another class that's inside the prison at the time. Yeah.
That's great. So, I think one thing we should clarify for the students is this idea of being incarcerated, right? Because there's different ways to be incarcerated.
Absolutely.
There's jails, there's prisons. Can you tell us a little about that?
So the main distinction between jail and prison, jail is really temporary in that you haven't been sentenced yet. The longest you might serve in a county jail is maybe 3 years. And that's why you're waiting to go to trial. So you're also around a lot of people that are coming and going. So you might have been in there for a year yourself, but you might be in there with someone that's only been in for a day, that's going to be leaving the next day. And in prison, it's a little bit more static, the population, and you're actually there for a longer period of time. You've been sentenced. Typically, you're housed for a longer period of time at the institution where you're assigned to. And you're not really around a lot of people that are coming and going so much. The only people that you're around that have contact to the outside are staff, whereas in county jail, you're more susceptible to come into contact with something coming in from the outside in a county jail.
That's a good distinction to know. And also, I think for the students, we want to kind of orient them to the types of people that are incarcerated. I think a lot of times when you ask someone, who do you think of when you think of an incarcerated person, they might have a certain idea in their mind, but I was looking up some numbers and found that there are 2.3 million incarcerated people in jails, prisons, juvenile detention centers, immigration detention centers. 231,000 of those are women and girls, 48,500 youth, and 10% of them are over the age of 55. I found those statistics fascinating. So do you just want to talk to us a little bit about the types of people that are incarcerated?
Yeah, well, in Missouri, like the ethnicity is like, I think it's like 34% Black, 63% white, and then 2.5% other. And then you have like a 10% are women, 90% are male. And then you have like 44.5% are from the ages of 17 to 34. And then 34 or 35.9% are from the ages of 35 to 49. And then 19.6% are 50 and over. So there is a very wide variety of people within that are incarcerated, and socioeconomically also. The majority of us are poor, but you also have wealthier people that are in there also, like CEOs of corporations actually as well too. So
yeah, that's interesting. So can you give us just kind of a day in the life of what typically, outside of COVID times, what's it normally like to be incarcerated?
It's monotonous, really. It's like Groundhog Day. You wake up and every day is the exact same. At MECC, the last institution where I was, you get counted every day. Like the day starts at like 5. They turn the lights on to the wing, to the unit at 5 o'clock. You can get up, leave your cell at this institution, leave your cell, go use the restroom, brush your teeth, take a shower, things like that. You can heat your coffee up at the microwave. But really the day starts at like 6. That's when the alarm goes off, where everybody has to stand up outside their cell, get counted. And then after count, you go back in your cell until generally for about a half an hour until count clears. And then you get out and you kind of start your day. You really can't go out on the yard or anything yet, but you can get out and move around and go visit other people in other cells and things like that. Really, they don't call movement until about 8 o'clock. And then at 8 o'clock, you could get out and go to recreation, the rec center. And at rec, they have like weights. They have some treadmills. They have a track. You can play basketball, horseshoes, things like that. But I mean, it's kind of limited, really. And then like the people you see every day, it's boring. It's monotonous. And then there's also like there's also like a darker side to that. Also, there's a lot of fights because you are like in close. You're like in a close proximity with a lot of people with a lot of different personalities that come from a lot of different backgrounds. So it creates a lot of tension between a lot of people. And yeah, sometimes that comes to a head and you get gang wars in there. Sometimes it's not like anything you see on like Locked Up or 90 Days In. It's not that violence, but there is violence. Yeah.
I could imagine that sounds like a very tense situation, and people are probably grumpy, to put it mildly. So I could see how there would be a lot of difficulty.
Yeah.
So given that, I guess one thing with COVID is that we've been focused on these different things that people can do to try and protect themselves, to protect their communities. Let's walk through some of those and kind of talk about what that actually looks like if you're incarcerated. Right. So the first one, of course, washing your hands. We're all supposed to be washing our hands all the time. What's that like if you're incarcerated? Because we think of that as such a simple thing, right? And like part of this is understanding that these things are not so simple for everyone. We talked, for example, to someone about COVID in Indian country, and they were talking about how there are certain tribes that don't have any water, and so they have to truck in water every day. So what's this like for incarcerated people?
So they give you soap. They provide soap for you. It's not antibacterial soap or anything like that. If you want to use antibacterial soap, you have to purchase it off a canteen. And I mean, that's your personal soap now. It's not anything that they provided for you. Anything with like alcohol in it, you're not getting, because the like maybe 1 or 2% that might drink it, they make it so that like the other 99 or 98% can have access to these things. They do encourage you to wash your hands, especially like in the bathrooms. There's signs posted everywhere, wash your hands, but they don't necessarily provide the actual PPE to like actually clean your hands the proper way, really, right? There's a lot of staph infection is rampant in prison. Hepatitis C also, you can't really get that from not washing your hands. Hep A, things like that though as well, yeah.
Do they immunize against, I mean, Hep A, for example, you could be immunized against that. Do they immunize?
Yes, they do, but you have to request it specifically through medical services. They will give you your Hep A and Hep B vaccinations, but it's not something that they just like willingly like give you. You know, even if you work in food services, like in St. Louis City, if I were to work in food services, I would have to have these immunizations in order to get hired. That's not necessarily the case in the Department of Corrections. You can still work in food services without having these vaccinations.
Wow, that's a fascinating side tangent that I want to talk to you about sometime in the future. But to stay on topic for now, you mentioned canteens. Can we go back to that and just clarify what that is and how that works?
A commissary or canteen rather, is so they provide you with like this certain like just like the basic necessities that you need to survive, like soap, toothpaste, shampoo, and then your regular meals and things like that, and then like change of clothes. If you want anything outside of that, you can buy it from canteen, and basically it's just essentially like a lot of the stuff you can find at a gas station, maybe a little lesser quality. We can buy some clothes that are made through Missouri Vocational Enterprises, which is like a corporation that is run by the Department of Corrections or the state. It kind of teaches like technical trades to inmates, I guess, at like slave labor. Anyways, so yeah. So, but anyways, and you can buy other hygiene things. There's some, I guess, medical things you can buy, like antifungal creams, Tylenol, things like that. Yeah.
How do you get the money to buy those things?
Well, the money is sent to you through like your family members, and they use like a money collection service called JPay. It's like an it's kind of like a Western Union, but it's just specifically for correctional institutions.
So, I mean, basically, if you want to buy antibacterial soap, you need to have money from someone outside that can afford to send you money.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's complicated. Okay, so another thing that we hear a lot about and that we keep telling the students is avoid large gatherings. To me, it sounds like it's all one large gathering. So how does that work in prisons?
Well, so it depends on the prison also. So if you're in a higher security level institution, it's easier to stay away from larger gatherings because you're segregated more from larger segments of the population. You're locked in your cell for 23 hours out of the day. If you go into the lower level institutions, you can actually get out and move around in the pods. So you might, the largest group you might be forced to like interact with might be about 100 people, like depending on like the size of the pod. And that is like really hard to stay away from or to actually like exercise like social distancing when you're in a housing unit that has a wing that has 100 people in it, because a lot of the times you guys have to share the same showers, same restrooms, things like that. Now some cells do have wet cells where they have restrooms inside the cells, and the cells are typically about the size of a large bathroom, just minus the shower. So yeah, they're not very big cells.
Yeah.
And you're in there, and there's 2 people typically to each cell also. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. And so then another thing we've been hearing is stay home, right? So a lot of the country went on these stay-at-home orders. I mean, some people may think like, oh, that works out great if you're in prison. I mean, you mentioned that in jails you have a lot more people coming and going, but is it the case that also in prisons you have people that are coming and going, and it's not truly like you're being isolated at home?
No, you're not necessarily being isolated at home, and you can't be isolated. Well, they could isolate you. They very easily could isolate you and then just bring the food to your cell. But yeah, so there's as far as visitors coming and going from the prisons, obviously all the staff, they're not segregated at the facility. So, and you can't monitor the staff and tell them they can't go to Walmart, right? So they're bringing things in and out, and not only viruses, but also other contraband as well. And then you have VICs, which are volunteers in corrections, which the professors and the tutors that work for the Department of Corrections or work for PEP, they're actually VICs and they go in. Right now, they're not going in. There are like limited religious organizations that are still going in. Christians, I think at the height of it, they stopped them from going in. I don't think they're going in at this minute, but I know up until like May, they still had Christian organizations that were going into the prison. And also, you can't just like, so movement within the facility has been extremely limited. Now you're not like, it's not like you're interacting with other people from other housing units unless you work in food services, and they're making everybody kind of voluntarily like have to, they're forcing you to work for food service. But so you're the like only thing that they restricted you, it's not like you sent you home, it's just they're restricting your access to other housing units. As an individual, I can't now have access with another housing unit. So that's the only thing that they restricted the inmates from doing.
Interesting. Okay. And then what about, we hear so much about masks. Have masks been provided to people?
Yes. They did initially distribute some masks to the inmate population. I want to say it was in April that they distributed the masks, but there isn't any requirements requiring you to wear any masks. There's no requirements, like there's no like distances where like if you're within like 6 feet of someone, you have to have the mask on. They try to encourage you to wear the mask within the housing units, but you're in the housing unit all day long. You can't have the mask on all day long, right? And there's no AC in these housing units either, right? So when it's 100 degrees outside, it's about 110 degrees, 120 degrees inside the housing units. And that depends on if they have like air circulating. And I have a beard, and I know walking around outside for me, having the mask on for a limited amount of time, that I have to wear it. It's uncomfortable for me. Can you imagine wearing that all day long in these housing units? Yeah, it's impossible. And so the staff themselves aren't required to wear masks right now either. They're encouraged to wear them in certain areas, but there's still no like requirements for them to wear the masks within the facility.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize that it was 110 degrees on hot days. I mean, we have a lot of really hot days in this area. So then that would mean maybe one of the other things we've heard is helpful is to be outside. And given that it's so hot inside, are there a lot of opportunities for people to be outside so that they can be safe, you know, and hopefully more comfortable, maybe at least a little bit outside?
No, there's very limited access to outside. It depends on, so before you had like 3 movements a day, and you had access to go outside during 2 of those movements to either go to like a small yard, which is like right out in front of the housing unit, a small, just like, and the only people you have access to on that small yard are people from that housing unit. Or you could go out to a larger yard, which you had access to socialize with people from one other housing unit on the yard at that time. That's since been limited to, you can only socialize with people from your housing unit, and you only get to go outside twice a week, once a day now, and it's for 3 hours a day. Yeah. And so they still have the small yard, but it's for maybe a half an hour at a time, because they have like each housing unit, they're trying to limit the socialization between the wings as well also. So, yeah.
I'm really grateful that the way this Zoom is set up is that whoever's talking, that's who the camera's on, because Harvey, you're the only one who can see my face, and I'm not doing I don't have a poker face. So as you can tell, as you're saying things, I'm having a very big reaction. I mean, the situation you're describing sounds really difficult and very much not ideal for this current pandemic that we're dealing with. So, I mean, I know that you stay in touch with people that are still incarcerated. What is the situation like for incarcerated people with COVID-19? Oh,
Um,
hi, you have a cat.
I've got two small kittens. Finally woke up. But so they at the beginning they were scared about the situation, right? But now it's not really, they're not really scared so much. It's just they're just like resigned to, okay, I'm gonna get it, and it's just a matter of when I'm gonna get it. And they're ready for this all to just kind of like move on, really, because the Department of Corrections hasn't done anything really to stem the spread. If in fact they've done more to like spread it through like transferring individuals that have come in from uh, county jails, local facilities, to diagnostics facilities, and then from those diagnostics facilities they spread them into the general population throughout the system. So there's a lot of like frustration with inmates because they see like where things could be done better. They're frustrated because of the mask situation. They're frustrated with COs not wearing masks. They're frustrated because they don't have access to PPE. In fact, so in order to get like access to like bleach, yeah, there's like a black market for bleach, really, which is kind of crazy. So they've taken all bleach from the facilities because it had been stolen and then sold to inmates so they could wash their hands. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be distributed that way. It was going to be used for other like washing clothes and things like that, which is important, right? But it wouldn't have been inmates wouldn't have had access to it. So yeah, there's a and there's been some tension with there was a riot about a month ago out at MECC with over all of this because they are making people work in food services come into contact with inmates from other housing units. You know, in some of these housing units, there's known positive cases there. So the inmates aren't allowed themselves to practice like the CDC guidelines, suggested guidelines.
Wow, okay. Yeah, I found some stats on what I found was that the infection rate for incarcerated people is 5 times that of the general population, and that they also have a higher death rate. So as opposed to 29 per 100,000, they have 39 deaths per 100,000 of infection or people. I should have double checked that stat. Anyway, and then the 5 largest US outbreaks apparently have been linked to correctional facilities. So, I mean, you know, this is, I mean, it's a dire situation, it sounds like, within correctional facilities, and we should also all be concerned as well because it's affecting people outside of the correctional facilities. So I guess I'm wondering, I mean, you named some things that seem to me like an obvious thing that they should stop, such as transferring people between prisons or between pods or cohorts. What sort of things are needed to reduce the spread of COVID in these places?
Well, obviously they need to stop transferring, and I think they have stopped transferring. So the Department of Corrections has given a couple of like updates on like their policy on like how they're handling COVID, and one of them just happened to be Monday. I missed it, unfortunately, but I do know that something that they had done is like during the very beginning of the pandemic, they had stopped all transfers. They had stopped like all like they had stopped most people from coming and going, other than like a few religious organizations. So everything had been kind of like, there wasn't a big like outbreak in the state of Missouri yet. There were like a few like random sporadic cases. Shortly after that, we had a meeting. So Prison Education Project, we're in the process of creating a reentry program, and we're in negotiations with the Department of Corrections. So we speak with the administration quite frequently. And anyways, they were talking about how they were going to start like doing like limited transfers to certain facilities that hadn't had any active cases at that time. Now, once they did those like limited transfers, such as one being to MECC, they said they had tested the individuals before they had transferred into MECC. 2 weeks later, both those individuals had tested positive. I'm sorry. They transferred 75 people into the Department of into MECC from Bonne Terre. 2 of those individuals 2 weeks later tested positive for COVID. Prior to that, though, MECC had only had like one positive, I think, and it might have been a staff member. After that, there was 56 active cases within a week, a couple of them being PEP students. Shortly after that, they did, the beginning of August, they did like an umbrella testing of the whole facility, and it jumped up to like 120 cases like shortly after that. Yeah. So really what needs to happen is they need to implement some really stringent policies on like PPE, like how it gets dispersed within the system, such as like inmates need to have access to it, proper like sanitizing materials for your hands. And then the staff definitely need to start wearing masks, not only like within when they're walking outside, you know, going from one unit to the other, but definitely while they're inside the units, they don't have to do that, right?
Yeah.
And then I think they need to be stricter with like, if you're going to work in in such a population that is such high risk, like the Department of Corrections, then maybe like your actions outside the institution need to be limited as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, it sounds like those are some very tangible suggestions that can reasonably happen, so they should. And I want to make an additional suggestion. I want to talk about decarceration, because I think that a lot of people have this misconception that everyone who is incarcerated is this dangerous criminal, and if we try and reduce the number of people that we have incarcerated, we're all in danger and whatnot. And I mean, we know that that's simply not true, right? There's lots of numbers on this. There are tons of nonprofits around the country that are working towards decarceration. It's actually a bipartisan issue, right? I think that like both parties feel pretty strongly about reducing the prison population in our country. And so I guess what would you say to people, because that's another thing that would help, really, if we just reduce the prison population, that would help with this problem. So what would you say to people who have this fear of reducing the prison population and decarceration?
Well, a lot of the reasons why people end up in prison isn't because you're bad. It's just because like your environmental issues and through like lack of opportunities. So if you start affording people, like giving people like access to opportunities like higher education or even quality education and quality healthcare, then you wouldn't have these like mass incarceration like you do now, because the other people start having to resort to other things, right? And then it becomes like a cultural situation at that point. If we start like rolling back and start rethinking how we as a society how we treat these things, right? And we start like instead of just like going in like gentrifying an area, start bringing education and healthcare and economic opportunities to these areas, then you wouldn't have to worry about incarcerating people at the rate that we're incarcerating them now. And also, like if you give people that are incarcerated the same opportunities that people on the streets have, then the likelihood that we're going to reoffend drops exponentially. Yeah.
That's great. And I want to move on to talking about people who are released. But I do think that's what you just said provides a great shout out also to the WashU prison education program, right? Because education is part of that, making sure that we don't have this mass incarceration issue. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so for formerly incarcerated people, when they come out, do they have the resources that they need?
No, very often we do not have the resources that we need. There's kind of just like basic like access to certain resources, but actually like it's almost impossible for someone that's getting out of prison to actually find like gainful employment. Housing is huge, like because a lot of housing companies, management companies won't rent to convicted felons, and it's legal for them to do that, right? So that's a hard thing, you know. If you can't find housing, then that's hard for you to even like find like a way to provide for yourself if you don't have like some kind of stability. So people like myself, formerly incarcerated people like myself, have like actually started so I've created this me and other people have created this like St. Louis Reentry Collective, and we help with like finding resources for formerly incarcerated people. One of them is we have a reentry fund, and we help provide immediate financial assistance to formerly incarcerated people that need access to medication, rent, utilities, things like that, transportation. And also, we've created a reentry resource guide that just points you in the direction and lets you know what resources you have access to.
That's wonderful. I'm going to get those resources from you and put them on our Canvas page, because the students are always asking, and they've been asking during this conversation, how they can help. And I'll come back to that question a bit later too. But I do want to point out that the students know on the syllabus today, we were meant to have two of you. Kareem Martin was also going to join us, and exactly what you're talking about not having the resources that are needed. Unfortunately, Kareem wasn't able to be part of the conversation today because he didn't have access to a device that he could use Zoom on. And I mean, I think that's such an important point right now. Obviously, that's an issue for formerly incarcerated people overall, but in a moment when we are shifting so much of our life to virtual life, the fact that we are setting people up to fail when they are released from prison is really important, and also adds to this conversation that we've been having with, across the board in the US, the fact that there truly are people who do not have access to high-speed internet or to the devices that they need to participate in things like this. So it's so important for us to keep that in mind when we're thinking about our actions and about this pandemic and about the disparities that exist. And I did want to say that Kareem really wanted to be here, and
yes, he did.
I know that you were working with him to try and figure out a device for him to use. I was working with him also. I know he's disappointed. So, but I'm glad that you can be here and speak to us about these issues. So let's see. Okay, so obviously it's a big challenge. What are things that could be done to kind of help, particularly in this time period as people are being released from prisons? What would help to make the transition smoother?
Well, something for society to do specifically, or something like just like as individuals we can do.
Either way.
I know, just like allowing, just for one, taking, I know that you can take the box off of an application, and you can still go on Google and find where that information is very easily through Missouri CaseNet. So finding out whether or not someone is a felon isn't very hard to do, but just take that box off. That's an important thing. And then allowing people like to have access to housing, like I said again, and then like having access to gainful employment for one. And then something we've been thinking about is setting up a scholarship type thing. So when you get out of prison, you have access to like some immediate funds that are going to help you. If you weren't able to save them while you're in prison, now you're going to be able to like have access to them. So you will be able to find housing. It'll give you enough time to find job. It'll give you the cat.
It's so cute.
You'll be able to find food as well, because it's sometimes you can't always get out and get on food stamps right away or SNAP benefits. So just allowing people like opportunities, just forgetting that someone was in prison when you talk to them, just don't ask that question. It doesn't matter. Right?
Yeah, that's great. Well, so the students have a lot of questions that I want to ask you. Some of the students were wondering if there have been any policy changes that are positive during the pandemic for incarcerated people. And if so, if those might stay. It sounds to me like actually the policy changes have moved in a negative direction.
Yes.
So maybe we don't want any of those to stay after.
I mean, no, as far as like anything going with like reducing incarceration rates or nothing, no policy has changed. Something that did happen over the summer back in, the House of Representatives did vote for a clean repeal on the ban for Pell eligibility for incarcerated individuals. So I know Obama had set up this like second chance Pell experiment, and that has to get like revised like every 2 years. Well, the House of Representatives and the Senate are making a big push to kind of like remove like the ban on like Pell eligibility for incarcerated individuals. The House already voted on it. It was a unanimous repeal pretty much. So, but the Senate still needs to vote on it. Hopefully we can get Mitch McConnell to move on that because it's kind of important, right?
Yep.
But yeah, I haven't noticed there's no policy has like, and we are like trying to like push for them to start like releasing individuals that are at high risk, you know, start like kind of like reducing the populations, start like emptying prisons of nonviolent offenders that are nearing the end of their sentence. There's no reason why they should still be in prison right now, especially with like overcrowding. So hopefully we can get these things started, and those are the things that can stick, but they're not happening right now. No.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's a group, a law nonprofit in St. Louis called Arch City Defenders that has been doing some of that work also. Yeah, that's great. So related to policies, actually, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the students had a question about voting. And I think that probably some of the students on this call don't realize that formerly incarcerated people are limited in if they're allowed to vote or not. So can you, and the student's question is particular to the fact that you know, in this class, we've talked a lot about making sure you get out and vote because decisions at the local, state, and federal level are being made about how to handle the pandemic. And so can you talk about voting as a formerly incarcerated person?
All right. Yes. So once you completely satisfy your sentence in the United States now, meaning you're not on probation or parole, you've done the whole amount of time you were sentenced by the judge that sat over your case, you can vote. You can, it depends on what state it is. The federal government gave the states the right to give back, felons their voting rights back. Missouri happens to be one of them. So I've completely satisfied my sentence. So I've registered to vote and I can vote in this upcoming election. Yeah.
That's
but
wonderful.
For the majority of people still, you can't vote though, as a convicted felon. There's still quite a few states that don't allow you to vote. And while you're still on probation and parole and unfortunately that ends up becoming the case though through like recidivism rates is a lot of these people are silenced through that, you know, they make these laws that you can't vote until you get off until you satisfy your sentence, but then a lot of the times it's just through cultural things you end up right back on probation and parole, so it's impossible for you to vote through those kinds of practices.
Yeah. Students are also wondering then for currently incarcerated people, given that we're getting so much news about the pandemic, how do they get news? How are they finding out?
So you can order the newspaper. You can get the newspaper, and then also you have TVs like these little tiny flat screen clear TVs where you can you have access to local news, and then CNN, the Fox, the local, or the big like 3 MSNBC as well. Yeah. I do know that OCC, which is a long-term treatment facility outside of Springfield, they have limited their access to outside news because of the pandemic. Yeah.
What can you explain why they would do that?
Well, because they actually, as a long-term, you're still incarcerated, but you're going through like a long-term drug treatment programming as well, and you're working also in a factory setting. So I think they're trying to like limit like try not to scare the people that are going and working in the factories. I guess I don't know what I don't know what their purpose would be for like limiting it at OCC and not anywhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So students want to know how they can help. They have a lot of really specific questions like how can they donate PPE? How can they help people who are released from prisons? How can they help people that are currently incarcerated? How can they help raise awareness? So do you have recommendations? I mean, they want to help in every possible way. So what are ways that they could help?
Okay, so student volunteers, there's a group on campus called Interrogating Incarceration. You can get in touch with them, and they work with raising funds and awareness for the Prison Education Project, Washington Prison Education Project. Also, as far as like donating PPE, I don't know where there's any place where you could donate PPE right now because they're really like stringent on like introducing things into contraband things into the Department of Corrections. But you can just get in touch with the governor, contact your local lawmakers. That's what's really going to change things, really, right? So just get in touch with them, and then that will obviously have a huge effect, really, when you start doing it in numbers, just like voting.
And when they get in touch, they should be asking to make sure that these safety measures are put in place in detention centers, right? So like not moving around, all of that, wearing masks and so on. And then should they also be asking about, what other things should they be asking about?
All right, so when you get in touch with your lawmaker, ask them to start releasing nonviolent offenders that are nearing the end of their sentence, right? That'll help, like, kind of lower the numbers. It'll help you social distance a little bit more. People that are sick, right? People that have diabetes, that are already like at high risk populations, incarcerated, try thinning them out, allow them to leave, medically parole some of the people that are on dialysis, things like that. And then allow us to have access to proper PPE, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Students were actually wondering about that. So I'm glad you brought up people that are sick. They were wondering, what does healthcare or medical care look like if you get really sick when you're incarcerated? How are you treated?
Yeah, so it's you can't go to the hospital like you can on the street. If you get sick, there's a procedure. If it's something that's like really drastic, you can declare a medical emergency. You contact the nearest correctional officer to you, and you tell them, and then they just are kind of like this like filter. They decide whether or not it's drastic enough to go on to the next step, which be to their supervisor, and then the supervisor calls down to medical to see if it's really an emergency, and then you might get to see medical. Generally, it's like if it's a life-threatening, like you're bleeding out or something like that, is what an emergency constitutes. Otherwise, you have to fill out what's called a health service request sheet, and then you put that in like a collection spot where they come and like pick it up once a day, and then maybe 2-3 days later you might get to go see medical, and then that'll just be like a triage, and then like 2-3 days later you might see the doctor.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Students are also wondering, just a clarifying point, you mentioned some items like bleach that are in limited supply, or that they're not allowed to have in large supply. Can you explain why that is? You did a little bit with the alcohol, but why are there some? Yeah.
Well, bleach, it can be used to, sorry, my cat. Bleach can be used.
The students love your cats, by the way. Everyone in the question box is just going crazy over your cats.
So, all right, the bleach can be used to throw in someone's eye, like if there's a fight, right? You can use it for things like that. You can put it in someone's drink. So there are many different things you could do with the bleach. You can use it to like alter your clothes, right? And that's something that they don't want. They don't want you altering state property. They want you being uniform, looking like everyone else around you. You can alter your appearances with it. So there's a lot of different things that could be done with the bleach that they try to limit, like how people have access to the bleach.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
One other question related to something else we learned about in this class. We learned about stigma in COVID. So people who get COVID-19 have a lot of stigma. Is that happening also within prisons?
It is and it isn't. I mean, so I haven't heard of anybody being like stigmatized because they had it and they're trying to like, I know once you do contract it, they put you in a quarantine wing, which is kind of like it's isolation. You're limited in your movement around the wing. So you can still use the phone, you can use the restroom, you can use the microwave, but you're not allowed to go out and hang out and like socialize. If you do test positive, it's you and your cellie that are then transported into this isolation wing. But as far as like you being treated any differently in the facility, I haven't heard anything about that, no.
Okay, that's good to know. So we're actually down to our last couple minutes. So I just wanted to ask you if, we have several minutes, so feel free to take as much time as you need. I'm just wondering, generally, if there's anything you want people to know about incarceration in general, or the Prison Education Project, or COVID and incarceration.
Incarceration in general, I mean, just a lot of the times, like I said earlier, a lot of us are just, we just didn't have access to the same opportunities that a lot of people did. So we made different choices and we ended up in prison. Allowing us had to have access to these opportunities now it not only does it affect us positively, it affects the community in a positive way also, because then we are able to come out and become leaders in the community and help educate people about incarceration and the stigmas of incarceration, you know, tell a different narrative that locked up and 60 days in aren't telling, because that's not the truth of what goes on inside prison. Really, it's not. That's a very small portion of it. And also, I guess, just, I mean, if you feel that passionate about doing something about it, just get up and do something, volunteer in one of these programs, interrogating incarceration, the PEP program. You can volunteer as a tutor if you're a student or as a TA. The cats. And anyways, volunteer. So we also have the St. Louis Reentry Collective, which is a not-for-profit that I helped co-found, that you could help volunteer. You could donate to the St. Louis Reentry Fund that helps provide immediate financial assistance. There are all kinds of things you can do to help change this, right? And just just start discussing it, instead of when people start talking about negative things that are going on with incarceration, just start changing the narrative to something positive, how it can be changed. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so we are now running out of time. Are there any last words that you want to say to the students?
Just thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. I think this has been wonderful, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
To the rest of you, we will be back here tomorrow for our last class. Until then, stay safe.